past year, there's been a lot of talk and a lot of theories about the shape of the recovery. Is it going to be V-shaped? Is it going to be U-shaped? Is it going to be L-shaped? We've heard about square root-shaped recoveries, inverse square root-shaped recoveries, or the square root sign. Joined now by Michael Pento, Senior Market Strategist of Delta Global Advisors. And you have yet another symbol for us. You think it's going to be a TP-shaped recovery?
Yes, unfortunately, I do believe it's going to be a TP-shaped recovery.
Which obviously goes like this, and comes down like that.
Yes, unfortunately, that's what I see. I've never seen a V-shaped recovery occur when commercial bank lending was down 7% year over year. So if small businesses are not getting loans to create capital goods and to expand production and to hire individuals, how can you possibly have a V-shaped recovery? I think, unfortunately, we're going to have a TP-shaped recovery as we unwind all the stimulus that was provided from us by the Fed and the Treasury.
Right. Well, let's talk about that because a lot of folks, including people like Jim Grant, who's typically on the bearish side, have been saying it is going to be a V-shaped recovery because what happens is the steeper the decline, the sharper the rebound you get. And, looking at past recessions, you mentioned the commercial bank lending. You've also talked about where the consumer was.
We have consumer, their household debt as a percentage of GDP is now at 95%, twice the level it was the last time we had unemployment this high, 10%
so in the early 1980s.
in 1983. Right. If banks aren't lending money, if job growth is AWOL, don't forget, coming out of the 91 recession and the last recession, 2001, 2002, we had a jobless recovery. Our employment gains have come from the building and servicing of asset bubbles. We don't have a diverse manufacturing base in this country. If we did, we could boost manufacturing, sell our products to overseas, and become a wealthier nation. We are not going to do that. We have had job growth that came from servicing the NASDAQ bubble in the late 90s, no offense, and the property bubble in the mid 2000s. So we have to wait till we engender another bubble so we can hire people to service that, unfortunately. So if you don't have job growth, you have massive leverage that still has to be unwound on the public and the private sector. And banks aren't lending money. How can you possibly have a V-shaped recovery?
Another point you make, which I think is very telling, is that the Fed interest rates really have only one direction to go, which is higher. Right. And so that's going to be a headwind as well. But there's a difference between a V-shaped recovery and a TP. Like, what's going to make it roll over? And sharply is what a TP suggests, as opposed to flattening out, which is the square root sign.
If they're talking about the dissolution of the European Union, if the euro is under a tremendous amount of pressure, the euro currency, if China is raising rates and reserve requirements, along with Australia and other countries, where is the growth going to come from in demand from overseas? That's going to be non-existent. And if the Federal Reserve is going to raise interest rates, or at least attempt to feign a little bit of tightening, and the long end of the curve, which the Fed does not control, is starting to respond to the inflation that is represented by $1 trillion blow up in the monetary base, what's going to happen to this country's ability to grow? Right.
And at the same time, as you write about as well, we have tremendous deficits that we're looking at as well.
10% of GDP, as far as the eye can see. We're going to double the amount of outstanding debt, publicly traded debt, within the next 8 years. That's a tremendous pressure that we have on our interest rate expense coming up in the next few years. And it also could engender a dollar crisis, maybe not against the euro, but certainly against Brazil, Australia, and maybe even against China.
Right. So since you mentioned what's going on in Europe, there are people out there comparing our situation to Greece's situation, saying we're in the same boat they are with deficit to GDP at 10+%.
Right. Well, it's worse, and I'll tell you why. It's worse than Greece because Greece represents about 2.5% of European GDP. Okay, and the euro is not the world's reserve currency. The U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. If our currency gets into trouble, and if the Chinese decide to sell their position in bonds, you're going to have a bond market crisis, and you're going to have a dollar crisis. Tell me what shape recovery that's going to yield to the United States.
Right, but it does seem, at least at the moment, the crisis in Europe is benefiting the dollar because it is the world's reserve currency. And we saw that in 2008 when the credit market seized up.
It is now.
The dollar fared better.
It is now. And if you want to invest that it will always be the world's reserve currency, you can do so at your own peril.
Of course. And before we wrap, so there was a very strong fourth quarter GDP report, 5.7%. Was that the top of the TP in your?
I
area?
I think it was. You have a reduction in the second derivative of inventory drawdowns, which in
that was
the world,
more than half of the
world
growth,
of GDP math, that means you have growth in GDP.
Right.
You also had a 0.4 or 0.6%. And I want to be exact here. This is very important. But even if you take the average of that, if I'm wrong, 0.5% annualized inflation from the GDP report. So
Right.
they took nominal GDP and deflated it by 0.4, 0.5%. If you think inflation in this country is only 0.4 or 0.5%, then I have some gold to sell you.
All right, Michael. Thanks very much.